The vast Canadian wilderness, blanketed in the hushed embrace of winter, was a kingdom of silent white. Snow lay thick and unbroken, a pristine canvas stretching to the distant, slumbering peaks of the Laurentian Mountains. It was the year 1850, and the world outside the secluded valley moved at a pace dictated by the sun and the seasons, a stark contrast to the hurried rhythms of cities far to the south. Within this hushed expanse, nestled beside a frozen, snow-laden creek, stood a small, sturdy cabin, its logs dark with age and weathered by countless winters. Smoke, a thin, curling ribbon of gray, rose lazily from its stone chimney, a solitary signal of warmth and life in the immense quiet. The air, crisp and impossibly pure, carried a faint, earthy scent of pine and the sharp, clean bite of frost. Inside, the cabin was a sanctuary of simple, purposeful things. A hearth, its stones blackened by years of fires, glowed with the embers of last night's blaze, casting a warm, flickering light across the rough-hewn timber walls. The air was thick with the comforting aroma of wood smoke and the lingering, faint sweetness of dried herbs hanging in bunches from the rafters. A sturdy wooden table, scarred with the marks of many meals and mended tools, occupied the center of the room, and beside it, a simple cot, its straw mattress neatly made. A few well-used traps, their metal gleamed dully in the firelight, leaned against one wall, and a stack of carefully cut firewood sat ready near the hearth. It was a place built for endurance, for solitude, and for the quiet rhythm of a life lived in harmony with the wild. The first hint of dawn, a pearly luminescence that softened the edges of the surrounding forest, crept through the small, greased paper window. It was a gentle awakening, a slow seep of light rather than a sudden intrusion. A figure stirred within the shadows of the cot, a man named Elias, whose face, etched with the lines of sun and wind and contemplation, was now softened by sleep. His breathing was deep and even, the sound a quiet counterpoint to the occasional creaks and groans of the old cabin settling in the cold. His long, dark hair, streaked with gray, lay tangled on the rough pillow, and his hands, callous and strong, rested loosely at his sides. He was a man of the woods, his body attuned to the subtle shifts of the natural world, and his sleep was as deep and restorative as the winter earth. Slowly, deliberately, Elias began to stir. It was not a sudden jolt, but a gradual unfolding, a mindful returning to consciousness. His eyelids fluttered, then opened, revealing eyes the color of deep forest moss, now taking in the familiar, comforting details of his cabin. He stretched a long, slow arch of his back that sent a satisfying warmth through his limbs, and a quiet sigh escaped his lips. The cold was a constant companion in winter, a presence that seeped into every corner, and he could feel it now, a faint chill that nudged him toward the warmth of the hearth. He swung his legs over the side of the cot, his bare feet finding the rough, cool planks of the floor. The immediate priority was the fire. Elias moved with a quiet grace, his movements economical and practiced. He approached the hearth, the embers still holding a faint, orange glow. Kneeling, he gently blew on the dying embers, his breath a warm gust that coaxed them back to life. Tiny sparks, like fleeting fireflies, danced upwards, and a faint, welcome warmth began to radiate from the stones. He then reached for a small pile of dry tinder, the fluffy, grayish fibers of dried cattail fluff, and placed it carefully amongst the glowing coals. With a piece of flint and steel, he struck a spark, and with a soft hiss, the tinder caught, a tiny flame blossoming into existence. He added a few small, dry twigs, then larger pieces of seasoned pine, each one carefully chosen for its dryness and the satisfying snap it would make as it burned. The flames grew, licking upwards, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and filling the cabin with a more robust, comforting heat. The scent of burning pine, clean and resinous, mingled with a lingering wood smoke, creating an aroma that was the very essence of winter comfort. Elias watched the fire, a quiet contentment settling over him as the cabin began to truly come alive with its warmth. The sounds of crackling were a gentle symphony, a soothing melody that eased away any lingering traces of sleep. With the fire established, Elias turned his attention to water. From a hook by the door, he lifted a heavy iron kettle, its black surface dulled by years of use and the occasional soot. It felt substantial in his hands, its weight a familiar presence, and the handle, worn smooth by countless grips, fit perfectly in his palm. He carried it to the now brightening hearth, and the faint scent of yesterday's boiled water, clean and mineral, wafted from it. He placed it carefully on the grate above the flames, the iron protesting with a low, resonant clang as it settled. The water within, drawn from the nearby creek and melted from the snow, was already beginning to warm. A soft gurgling sound soon joined the crackle of the fire. While the water heated, Elias began his morning ablutions. He reached for a rough woolen blanket, its fibers soft and comforting against his skin, and draped it around his shoulders. From a shelf, he picked up a small tin basin and carried it to the kettle. He carefully poured a measure of the warming water into the basin, the steam rising in a fragrant cloud that smelled faintly of minerals and the clean outdoors. He dipped a piece of coarse linen into the warm water, the fabric absorbing the heat and the moisture, and then began to wash his face and hands. The water was not hot, but pleasantly warm, and it felt invigorating against his skin, chasing away the last vestiges of sleep and the chill of the night. After drying himself with the linen, Elias returned to the fire. The kettle was now beginning to steam more vigorously, a soft, contented sigh emanating from its spout. He took down a small ceramic mug, its glaze a faded blue, and placed a generous pinch of dried, dark tea leaves into it. The aroma of the tea was earthy and slightly bitter, a promise of warmth and wakefulness. He carefully poured the steaming water from the kettle into the mug, the liquid a deep amber as it swirled with the tea leaves. He let it steep for a few moments, the steam carrying its invigorating scent throughout the cabin. Holding the warm mug in both hands, Elias sat at the table, though it felt solid and familiar beneath his forearms. He took a slow, deliberate sip of the tea, the warmth spreading through him, a comforting embrace against the winter chill. The taste was strong and grounding, a simple pleasure that anchored him to the present moment. He looked out the window, the pale light of dawn now illuminating the snow-covered landscape. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with frost, and the silence was profound, broken only by the gentle crackle of the fire and the softness of the kettle. The morning routine was meditation, a series of deliberate actions that brought order and comfort to his solitary existence. It was not rushed, but savored, each step imbued with a quiet purpose. He finished his tea, the last drops warm and satisfying, and placed the empty mug back on the table. The day had truly begun, and Elias, with the warmth of fire and the invigorating taste of tea, was ready to meet whatever it might bring, a day unfolding at its own unhurried pace. He rose from the table and moved towards a small wooden chest tucked into a corner. The hinges creaked softly as he opened it, revealing a neat stack of woolen clothing. He selected a thick, hand-knitted wool shirt, its fibers soft against the skin as he pulled it on, followed by a pair of sturdy woolen trousers. The layers were essential for the biting cold outside, each piece a testament to the warmth and resilience of natural materials. He then reached for a pair of thick wool socks, their yarn coarse but comforting, and pulled them on, his feet grateful for the insulation. Next came the outer garments, a heavy deerskin vest. Its surface worn smooth in places, was added for an extra layer of warmth and protection. The leather held the faint, musky scent of the animal and the wilderness. Finally, he carefully selected a thick woolen cap, its ear flaps designed to protect against the fiercest winds, and a pair of well-worn, fur-lined gloves that lay beside it. Each item was chosen not for its appearance, but for its functionality, for its ability to withstand the rigors of the winter landscape, and to keep him safe and comfortable. With his clothing adjusted, Elias surveyed his small domain. The cabin was now fully awake, bathed in the warm glow of the fire and the gentle light of the rising sun. The air was filled with the comforting sounds of his morning preparations, a symphony of crackling fire, bubbling water, and the soft rustle of wool. He felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, a deep contentment that came from the simple act of creating order and warmth in his environment. He then turned his attention to the traps. He picked up a sturdy, well-oiled rifle from its place above the hearth, its weight familiar and reassuring in his hands. He checked the action, his movements precise and practiced, and then placed it carefully back. Beside it, a small pouch containing ammunition was secured. He understood the risks and the rewards of his life, and preparedness was a constant companion. He walked to the window, pushing aside a section of the greased paper that had become slightly opaque with condensation. He looked out the world, a vast expanse of white stretching in every direction. The trees, heavy with snow, seemed to bow under their burden, and the silence was so profound that he could almost hear the whisper of the snowflakes as they continued to fall, though the sky was clear. A lone raven, a dark silhouette against the pale sky, circled lazily overhead before disappearing behind a distant ridge. Elias took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the crisp, clean air that seeped in from the edges of the window. It was a breath that tasted of pine needles and frost, of the untamed wild. He felt a sense of connection to this landscape, a deep belonging that had grown over years of living within its embrace. There was no urgency in his movements, no pressing need to be anywhere else. His day, like the winter itself, was unfolding at a slow, deliberate pace, governed by the rhythm of nature and the quiet needs of his existence. He opened a heavy wooden door, a gust of cold air rushing into the cabin, carried with it the sharp scent of pine and the deep, silent cold of the wilderness. The snow crunched softly under his boots as he stepped outside, the light of the morning sun reflecting brilliantly off the pristine white surface. The world was a symphony of muted colors, the deep greens of the pine trees, the stark white of the snow, and the pale blue of the sky. The silence outside was even more profound than within the cabin, a vast, unbroken stillness that was both humbling and invigorating. He stood for a moment, letting the cold air wash over him, a bracing sensation that cleared his mind and awakened his senses. The vastness of the landscape stretched before him, a silent invitation to explore its depths. The frozen creek, its surface a mirror of the sky, lay a short distance away, its banks lined with snow-laden branches. The air was so still that the smoke from his chimney rose in a perfectly straight column, a solitary sign of human presence in this immense, wild expanse. Elias adjusted the woolen cap on his head, pulling the ear flaps down to ward off the chill. He felt the familiar weight of the rifle slung across his back, a silent assurance of his ability to provide for himself. His gaze swept across the landscape, a practiced eye noting the subtle signs of the wild. The faint tracks of a rabbit in the snow, the distant silhouette of a hawk perched on a high branch. He was a part of this environment, an observer and a participant in its timeless cycles. He took a step away from the cabin, the snow crunching softly with each movement. The path ahead was his to choose, a blank canvas of white waiting to be traversed. There was no grand plan, no urgent quest, only the quiet intention of a day lived in accordance with a natural order. He moved with steady, unhurried pace, his silhouette a small, determined figure against the vast, indifferent beauty of the winter wilderness, ready to engage with the quiet routines that defined his solitary life. The day had begun, and the world outside the cabin held its breath, waiting for his next deliberate step. The snow, a soft, yielding blanket, whispered its greeting as Elias began his slow walk towards the woodshed. Each step was a gentle compression, a fleeting imprint that the wind would soon erase. The air, sharp and clean, carried the faintest scent of pine and the lingering, comforting aroma of wood smoke from his cabin chimney. He reached the woodshed, its rough-hewn logs standing stoic against the snow, and the familiar, comforting weight of the axe met his hand. It was a tool he knew intimately, its worn wooden handle smooth and warm from countless mornings just like this one. He chose a piece of seasoned pine, its grain dark and clear, and with a practiced swing, brought the axe down. The bite of steel into wood was a satisfying, solid thud, followed by the soft crackle as the logs split cleanly. He worked with a rhythm born of necessity and experience, each movement efficient and deliberate, the only sounds a rhythmic thud of the axe and the gentle sigh of the wind through the branches overhead. He stacked the split wood into neat piles, the rough bark cool against his gloved fingers, and a fresh scent of pine filled the air with each clean break. The task was simple, yet it held a profound sense of purpose, a tangible preparation for the day's needs. With an armful of dry kindling and a few larger logs, Elias returned to the cabin, the door heavy and solid, creaked open just enough to allow him to pass, and the contrast between the biting cold outside and the gentle warmth within was a welcome embrace. He placed the wood carefully beside the hearth, the familiar smell of the still warm ashes a comforting presence. The cabin was a sanctuary, a haven built with his own hands, and its quiet hum of existence was a language he understood perfectly. He moved to the cast iron kettle hanging over the dying embers of the fire. It was a substantial vessel, its black surface dull with use and time, and when he lifted it, the weight was a familiar burden, settling comfortably in his grip. The kettle held the lingering warmth of yesterday's water, and he could feel a faint, almost imperceptible vibration from the coals beneath. He carried it to the well, just a few steps from the cabin door. The rope, thick and braided, felt rough and sturdy in his hand, and as he lowered the bucket, the chain sang a low, melodic tune against the wood. The water, when it came, was icy cold, a shock that momentarily stole his breath. He poured it into the kettle, the splash and gurgle a lively sound in the otherwise hushed morning. Back at the hearth, he hung the kettle once more, its metal groaning softly as it settled into its place. He added a few more pieces of dry wood to the embers, coaxing them into a gentle flame, and watched as the water within the kettle began to shimmer and steam. The process was slow, unhurried, a quiet negotiation between fire and water. While the water heated, Elias turned his attention to his traps. He retrieved them from where he had stored them just outside the cabin, their metal surfaces cold and faintly damp from the night. He checked each one carefully, ensuring the springs were clean and the triggers were set just so, his fingers moving with a practiced, almost unconscious grace. There was a quiet satisfaction in this meticulous attention to detail, a silent understanding of the intricate balance between hunter and hunted. Back inside, the kettle was beginning to bubble, a soft, contented hum filling the cabin. The steam, rising in soft tendrils, carried the promise of warmth and refreshment. He poured a cup of the hot water, the ceramic mug feeling smooth and solid in his hands. He added a pinch of dried mint and a touch of honey, the sweet fragrance mingling with the earthy scent of the pine logs. He sat by the hearth, cradling the mug, and let the warmth seep into his hands and then into his body. The silence of the cabin was punctuated only by the gentle crackle of the fire and the soft hiss of the kettle. The morning light, now stronger, streamed through the small glass panes of the cabin window, casting long, dancing shadows across the rough-hewn floor. Dust motes, illuminated by the sunbeams, swirled lazily in the air like tiny, ephemeral spirits. Elias watched them, his gaze unfocused, lost in the quiet contemplation of the moment. There was no need for haste, no pressing obligation, only the gentle unfolding of the day. He finished his mint tea, the last sip warm and soothing, and then turned to preparing his breakfast. A piece of smoked venison, cured and hung from the rafters, was brought down. The scent of the smoke was deep and rich, a testament to the preservation of the meat. He sliced off a few thin pieces with his sharp hunting knife, the blade glinting in the firelight. The venison was firm to the touch, its texture slightly chewy, and the taste was robust and satisfying. He then took a small cast-iron frying pan and placed it over the fire. A dollop of rendered fat, saved from a previous kill, melted quickly, its sizzle a cheerful sound. The venison strips were added, and they curled slightly as they cooked, releasing a savory aroma that filled the cabin. He turned them with his knife, ensuring an even browning, and the sound of the gentle popping and hissing was a comforting accompaniment to the quiet morning. As he ate, Elias looked out the window, his eyes tracing the patterns of the snow-laden branches against the pale sky. A chickadee, a tiny speck of vibrant life, flitted from one branch to another, its cheerful chirping a welcome contrast to pervasive silence. He watched it with gentle amusement, a silent observer of the small dramas that played out in his wild domain. The world outside was a constant source of wonder, a tapestry of interconnected lives. After breakfast, the routine shifted. He needed to check his snares, a short distance from the cabin. He gathered his tools, a small knife, some twine, and a pouch for any small game he might have caught. The snow, undisturbed since his morning walk, offered a pristine canvas for any tracks. He stepped outside, the crisp air a familiar greeting, and began his rounds. The snow crunched softly beneath his boots as he followed the faint animal trails he knew so well. Each snare was checked with the same meticulous care as he had inspected his traps. He looked for any signs of disturbance, any telltale disturbance in the snow that indicated a successful catch. His movements were fluid and unhurried, a testament to his deep familiarity with the land and its inhabitants. He found a plump rabbit caught in one of the snares, its fur a soft gray against the white snow. There was no surprise, only a quiet acknowledgement of the day's bounty. He released the rabbit with practiced hands, its life now a part of his own sustenance. He cleaned it carefully, the cold air a helpful ally in the task, and then placed it in his pouch. The weight of it was a small, but significant, addition to his pack. The sun, now higher in the sky, cast a warm, golden glow over the snow-covered landscape. The shadows, once long and stark, had shortened, and the world seemed to awaken with a gentle, quiet energy. Elias continued his rounds, his gaze sweeping across the terrain, noting the subtle shifts in the light and the wind. He was a part of this rhythm, an integral element in the grand, slow dance of the winter season. Returning to the cabin, the rabbit cleaned and ready, he began the process of preparing it for pot. He carefully skinned it, the hide coming away cleanly, and then jointed the meat with his knife. The scent of fresh rabbit filled the air, a clean, earthy aroma that promised a hearty meal. He placed the meat in a pot with some dried herbs and a splash of water, and hung it over the fire to simmer. The afternoon was a time for quiet tasks. He mended a tear in his woolen trousers, his needle passing to the coarse fabric with a steady rhythm. He sharpened his knives, the rasp of the whetstone against steel, a familiar sound. He cleaned and oiled his rifle, ensuring it was in perfect working order, each action performed with mindful presence. These were the quiet rituals that sustained his life, the small acts of maintenance that kept his world in balance. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long, purple shadows across the snow, Elias prepared to check his larger traps. These were set further out, in areas where larger game might roam. He bundled up in his warmest furs, the thick wool and fur a comforting barrier against the deepening chill. The landscape, bathed in the soft, fading light, took on an ethereal beauty. The walk to the larger traps was longer, and the silence seemed to deepen with each step. The wind, would have been a gentle whisper, now stirred the branches of the pines, creating a low, mournful sigh. He moved with a steady gait, his senses alert, his eyes scanning the snow for any sign of recent activity. The vastness of the wilderness was a constant presence, a reminder of his own smallness within its immense embrace. At the traps, he found success. A young deer, caught securely, offered a substantial bounty. There was no triumph in his expression, only a quiet sense of gratitude. This was the way of the wilderness, a delicate exchange, and he accepted his part in it with a deep respect. He worked efficiently, field dressing the deer, and then carefully preparing it for transport back to the cabin. The journey back was slower, burdened by his catch. The weight was a familiar ache in his shoulders, a testament to his strength and resilience. The stars, now beginning to emerge in the darkening sky, were like scattered diamonds on a velvet cloth. The air grew colder, and the moon, a pale crescent, cast a soft, ethereal glow on the snow. Back in the warmth of his cabin, the fire had been replenished, casting a warm, inviting light. The scent of the simmering rabbit stew filled the air, a rich, comforting aroma. He hung the deer meat carefully, ensuring it would keep in the cold. The day's work was done, and a deep sense of quiet satisfaction settled over him. He sat by the fire, the crackling flames a soothing presence, and let the day's events drift through his mind like fallen leaves on a slow-moving stream. The world outside was silent and still, and within his cabin, a gentle peace reigned. The embers of the fire pulsed with soft, rhythmic glow, mirroring the slow, steady beat of his own heart. He watched the flames dance, their light glinting off the polished surface of his rifle propped against the wall, and felt the last vestiges of the day's exertion melt away. The rabbit stew, its savory fragrance now a constant, comforting presence, bubbled gently on the hearth, promising a nourishing meal. He stretched his legs, feeling the pleasant warmth seep into his muscles, and allowed his gaze to wander over the familiar details of his small, sturdy cabin. Each plank of wood, each carefully placed tool, spoke of countless days of labor and the quiet satisfaction of self-sufficiency. A faint creak from the timbers above signaled the settling of the cabin as the night deepened, a sound as familiar and reassuring as the wind sigh outside. He reached for his pipe, the smooth, worn wood cool and familiar in his callous hand, and began the ritual of filling it with dried tobacco. The process was unhurried. Each pinch of fragrant leaves a deliberate action. The aroma of the uncorked tobacco, earthy and sweet, mingled with the scent of wood smoke and the lingering richness of the stew, creating a perfume uniquely his own. He tamped it down with practiced thumb, the slight resistance a grounding sensation, and then struck a match, its brief flare illuminating his face in the dim light. The first draw from the pipe was deep and satisfying, the warmth spreading through his chest and a gentle haze of smoke unfurling towards the rafters. The world outside the cabin, with its vast expanses of snow and the hushed stillness of the forest, seemed to recede, leaving only this sanctuary of warmth and quiet. He leaned back against a rough-hewn log wall, the texture a pleasant contrast to the softness of his fur-lined tunic, and let his thoughts drift. There was no need for grand plans or pressing worries. The day had provided all that was necessary, and the night offered only the promise of rest. He rose eventually, his movements slow and fluid, and made his way to the sturdy wooden table where a half-finished carving lay waiting. It was a small, intricately detailed bird, its wings poised as if caught in mid-flight. His fingers traced the delicate lines he had already etched, feeling the subtle imperfections that made it uniquely his own. The wood, a light-colored pine, smelled faintly of resin and the forest floor from which it had come. He picked up his sharpest carving knife, its blade gleaming in the firelight, and began to work again, the soft rasp of metal against a gentle counterpoint to the fire's murmur. Each stroke of the knife was precise, a careful removal of slivers that revealed the form hidden within the block. He was not trying to replicate nature perfectly, but rather to capture a feeling, the sense of life and movement that he observed in the wild creatures around him. The little bird's beak was sharpened to a fine point. Its tail feathers fanned out with a delicate curve, and the slight tilt of its head suggested a moment of curiosity. The concentration required was a welcome distraction, a gentle focus that kept his mind from wandering into less settled territories. As he worked, the sounds of the cabin became more pronounced in the deepening quiet. The occasional pop and hiss of the logs in the fire, the soft rustle of his furs as he shifted his weight, and the distant, almost imperceptible murmur of the wind outside. These were the sounds of his life, the constant, quiet companions that filled the spaces between his thoughts. The moonlight, now stronger, began to filter through the small, square window, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor, and the scent of the stew had deepened, its richness now permeating every corner of the small space. He paused in his carving, holding the little bird up to the light, and admired the emerging form. It was a small thing, a humble creation, but it held a certain beauty, a testament to the quiet hours spent in its making. He ran his thumb over the smooth, polished curves, the wood now warm from his touch, and felt a sense of deep contentment settle upon him. This was the rhythm of his days, punctuated by the necessities of survival and the quiet indulgence of his solitary pursuits. With a final gentle stroke, he set the carving knife down and turned his attention back to the hearth. The stew had simmered for hours, its contents now tender and infused with flavor. He lifted the heavy cast-iron kettle from its hook, the metal warm and solid in his hands, and the faint scent of iron mixed with the hearty aroma of the stew. He carried it carefully to the table, its weight a familiar burden, and set it down with a soft thud. The rich, dark liquid within promised sustenance and warmth, a reward for the day's efforts. He ladled a generous portion into his wooden bowl, the spoon scraping softly against the ceramic. Steam rose in fragrant clouds, carrying the scent of root vegetables, savory meat, and the subtle hint of herbs he had gathered in the warmer months. He took his first bite slowly, savoring the rich flavors and the comforting warmth that spread through him. The rough texture of the bread he had baked earlier, its crust firm and its interior soft, was a perfect accompaniment. He ate deliberately, each mouthful a mindful appreciation of the food and the effort that had gone into its creation. The conversation of the wilderness outside had shifted. The wind sigh had deepened into a low moan, and the occasional snap of a frozen branch added a percussive element to the soundscape. Yet within the cabin, a profound stillness prevailed, broken only by the gentle sounds of his meal. He found a quiet pleasure in the solitude, in the absence of demands and distractions. His mind was free to wander, to reflect, and to simply be present in the moment. He finished his stew, scraping the last vestiges from a bowl with his spoon, and felt a pleasant fullness settle within him. The warmth of the meal, combined with the heat from the fire, created a cozy cocoon against the encroaching cold. He rose from the table, the satisfied ache in his belly a comforting sensation, and began the simple process of clearing away. The bowl and spoon were washed in a basin of water warmed by the fire, the steam rising to misty air, and then carefully dried and put away. The fire had begun to die down, the logs now glowing with a deep, steady heat. He added a few more pieces of seasoned wood, their dry surfaces catching the embers with a soft whoosh, and watched as the flames flared anew, casting dancing shadows once more. The light flickered on the polished wood of his rifle, the antlers hanging above the door, and the worn leather of his boots resting by the hearth. These were the objects of his life, imbued with the history of his days and the silent stories of his survival. He walked over to the window, the glass cold against his forehead as he pressed his gaze outwards. The moon had climbed higher, its silvery light illuminating the snow-covered landscape in stark, beautiful detail. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches laden with a fresh dusting of snow, and the vast, unbroken expanse of white stretched out to the horizon. It was a scene of breathtaking purity and immense power, a world held in a crystalline slumber. A sense of profound peace washed over him as he looked out at the silent wilderness. There was no fear, no longing, only a deep and abiding connection to this land that was his home. He was a small part of its grand tapestry, a single thread woven into its ancient fabric. The cold air that seeped into the window was a reminder of the world outside, but here, within the warm embrace of his cabin, he was safe and content. He turned away from the window, the moonlight still lingering in his vision, and moved towards his sleeping furs. The scent of cured hide and wool was comforting, familiar. He settled himself down, the soft padding of the furs yielding to his weight, and drew the thick woolen blankets up around him. The fire continued its gentle crackle, a lullaby of sorts, and the sound of the night filtered into the thick logs, softened and muted. His thoughts, no longer focused on the tasks of the day or the quiet contemplation of his surroundings, began to drift. Images of the forest, of the deer he had caught, of the intricate curves of the wooden bird, flickered at the edges of his awareness. They were not memories to be analyzed or dwelled upon, but rather gentle echoes of a day well spent, of a life lived in harmony with the natural world. He closed his eyes, the warmth of the fire and the softness of his bed enveloping him, and allowed the quiet embrace of sleep to draw him in. The stillness of the wilderness outside mirrored the stillness that had settled deep within his soul, and he drifted, unburdened and at peace, into the gentle currents of the night. The warmth of the fire, a steadfast companion to the long winter day, had begun to soften. Its flames, once leaping with energetic purpose, now settled into a more languid dance, casting a gentler, more diffuse light across the cabin's interior. The shadows, which had been sharp and defined earlier, now stretched and softened, blurring the edges of the rough-hewn furniture and the stacked firewood. The air, still thick with the accompanying aroma of wood smoke and dried herbs, carried with it a subtle shift, a hint of the day's energy yielding to the inevitable descent into evening. A faint chill began to insinuate itself into the cabin, a quiet reminder of the world outside. It wasn't a biting cold, but rather a subtle coolness that brushed against the skin, a whisper from the snow-laden pines. The trapper stirred, a slow, unhurried movement, and a deep sigh escaped his lips, a sound of contentment rather than weariness. The furs beneath him rustled softly, a familiar, reassuring sound in the growing quiet. He stretched his limbs, feeling the satisfying pull of muscles relaxed by hours of quiet labor and thoughtful repose. He opened his eyes, and the world within the cabin came back into focus, bathed in the amber glow of the dying embers. The smooth, worn surface of his wooden table caught his eye, and he remembered the small, unfinished carving resting there. It was a delicate feather, painstakingly shaped from a piece of birch, its barbs still rough to the touch. He felt a gentle urge to return to it, not out of obligation, but from a quiet desire to feel the familiar texture of wood beneath his fingers and the satisfying rasp of his knife. With a slow, deliberate motion, he pushed aside the thick woolen blankets and rose from his sleeping furs. The floorboards creaked softly beneath his moccasins, a familiar melody in the hushed cabin. He moved toward the table, his steps unhurried, and the warm wood felt solid and dependable underfoot. The air was still, carrying only the faint, sweet scent of pine that had seeped in from the surrounding forest. He reached for the carving, his fingers tracing the nascent curves of the feather. The wood was cool to the touch, and the faint scent of birch filled his nostrils. He picked up his well-used whittling knife, its wooden handle smooth and comforting in his grip, the metal blade gleaming dully in the firelight. The rhythmic scraping of the blade against the wood began, a soft, almost meditative sound that added another layer to the cabin's symphony of quietude. Each stroke was precise, deliberate, and born of years of practice. The shavings curled away from the knife, delicate wisps of wood that fell silently onto the table, adding to a small, growing pile. Outside, the last vestiges of daylight were surrendering to the encroaching twilight. The sky, which had been a pale, wintry blue, was now deepening into shades of lavender and rose, a fleeting blush before the full darkness of night descended. The snow, which had seemed so starkly white earlier, now took on a softer, more muted hue, reflecting the subtle colors of the fading sky. The silence of the wilderness seemed to deepen with the light, becoming more profound, more all-encompassing. The trapper continued his work, his movements fluid and practiced. He wasn't rushing, wasn't striving for perfection, but rather finding a quiet satisfaction in the simple act of creation. The feather was slowly taking shape, its delicate form emerging from the rough block of wood. He paused, holding the carving up to the light, and admired the growing symmetry, the subtle curves that suggested the lightness of a real feather. It was a small thing, a personal indulgence, a way to mark the passage of time and connect with the tangible beauty of the natural world. His gaze drifted to the window again, and he saw the first tentative pinpricks of starlight appearing in the darkening sky. The moon, a pale crescent now, offered only a sliver of its light, casting long, elongated shadows from the trees. The forest, which had been a bright, snow-laden expanse, was now a realm of deep blues and purples, its edges softened by the gathering gloom. A profound sense of stillness permeated the scene, a quiet anticipation of the long night ahead. He returned his attention to the feather, his hands moving with renewed focus. The air in the cabin felt warmer now, the fire having settled into a bed of glowing coals, radiating a steady, comforting heat. The scent of wood smoke was more pronounced, a familiar and grounding aroma. He felt a deep sense of peace, a quiet contentment that came from being in this place, engaged in this simple, solitary pursuit. There was no need for grand pronouncements or dramatic gestures, just the quiet rhythm of his own breathing and the gentle scrape of his knife. He placed a nearly finished feather on the table, a small testament to the passing hours. He stood for a moment, stretching again, and a faint ache in his shoulders reminded him of the day's physical exertion, though it was a pleasant ache, a feeling of a body well used. The cabin was growing cooler as the fire dwindled, and the silence outside seemed to press in a soft, velvety blanket of quiet. He looked around the familiar space, the stacked wood, the simple tools, the worn blankets, and felt a deep sense of belonging. A subtle hunger began to stir within him, not a sharp, demanding pang, but a gentle reminder of the body's needs. He moved toward the hearth, his steps still unhurried. The kettle, a sturdy, blackened cast-iron pot, sat on the edge of the cold hearth. He reached for it, his fingers wrapping around the cool, smooth metal of the handle. It had a satisfying weight to it, a grounded solidity that spoke of countless meals prepared and countless cups of tea brewed. He could almost smell the faint, lingering aroma of the last stew that had simmered within its depths, a ghost of savory warmth. He carried it to the table, the slight clinking of metal against a momentary interruption to profound silence. He then moved a snowdrift just outside his door, where a bucket of fresh, clean snow waited. The snow was cold, crisp, and pure, each crystal a miniature marvel. He scooped a generous amount into the kettle, the cold biting at his fingertips for a brief moment before he retreated back into the relative warmth of the cabin. The kettle, now filled with snow, was placed back on the hearth, positioned carefully over the remaining embers. A softness rose as the snow began to melt, and the scent of pure water, mingled with the faint aroma of wood smoke, filled the air. He watched the process with a quiet patience, the gentle bubbling a soothing sound that blended with the soft crackle of the dying fire. There was no urgency, no need to rush. This was the rhythm of his life, a steady, unhurried progression through the hours. While the water heated, he turned his attention to his meager larder. He opened a wooden chest, its hinges creaking softly, and a familiar scent of dried goods wafted out. Inside, he found a small pouch of dried berries, their color a deep, faded crimson, and a piece of hard, dark bread, dense and sustaining. He also unearthed a small wedge of hard cheese, its rind flecked with mold, and a handful of dried venison jerky. its texture tough and chewy. These were the staples of his winter diet, simple and nourishing. He broke off a piece of the hard bread, its texture yielding with a satisfying crunch. The cheese offered a sharp, tangy counterpoint, and the dry berries, though slightly tart, added a hint of sweetness. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, the simple flavors grounding him in the present moment. The kettle's gentle bubbling grew louder, a steady murmur that promised warmth and sustenance. As the water reached a simmer, a soft plume of steam began to rise, carried with it the pure, clean scent of heated snow. He carefully removed the kettle from the hearth, its handle still cool enough to grip. He poured the steaming water into a wooden mug, the liquid a clear, inviting stream. He then reached for a small tin of dried mint, its leaves brittle and fragrant. He crumbled a few leaves into the hot water, and a fresh, invigorating aroma bloomed, mingling with the steam. He carried the mug back to his chair by the hearth, settling into its familiar embrace. The warmth of the mug seeped into his hands, chasing away the last vestiges of the day's chill. He took a slow, deliberate sip, the hot, minty liquid warming him from the inside out. The taste was clean and refreshing, a perfect end to a day of quiet labor. The cabin was now bathed in the soft, orange glow of the embers, and the shadows danced gently on the walls. The sounds of the wilderness outside had also begun to shift. The wind, which had been a gentle sigh through the trees, now whispered with a slightly more insistent voice, rustling the snow on the branches. Occasionally, a distant owl would call out, its mournful cry a brief punctuation in the vast silence. But here, within the comforting confines of his cabin, these sounds were muted, softened, and became part of the overarching quiet. He sat by the fire, cradling the warm mug, his gaze lost in the dancing embers. His thoughts, which had been so active early in the day, now drifted like lazy smoke. He wasn't thinking of tomorrow's tasks or the challenges of the winter ahead. Instead, his mind was a quiet pool, reflecting only the gentle present, the warmth of the fire, the taste of the mint tea, the soft creak of the cabin settling. These were the simple, profound sensations that occupied his awareness. He finished his tea, the last drops leaving a lingering warmth. He rinsed the mug with a little more hot water, the steam rising in a final farewell. He then carefully banked the embers of the fire, a task performed with practiced ease, ensuring that a few glowing coals would remain to greet the morning. The light in the cabin diminished further, the orange glow of the embers now the only significant source of illumination, casting long, dancing shadows that played across the rough-hewn walls. The silence deepened, becoming almost palpable. It was a silence that wasn't empty, but full of the quiet hum of the sleeping forest, the distant whisper of the wind, and the steady rhythm of his own breathing. He felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet gratitude for the simple comforts of his cabin, for the solitude, and for the deep, abiding connection to the wild world that lay just beyond his door. The day had been long, but it had been a good day, a day filled with the quiet satisfaction of purpose and the gentle rhythm of existence. He rose, the floorboard sighing softly beneath his feet, and moved towards his sleeping furs, ready to surrender to the deep, restorative embrace of the winter night. The furs, piled high and soft against the far wall, beckoned with their promise of deep rest. He approached them slowly, his movements unhurried, each step a quiet affirmation of the day's gentle conclusion. The moose hide was cool and smooth beneath his bare feet, a familiar texture that grounded him in the present moment. And as he reached for bedding, his fingers brushed against the thick, downy undercoat of caribou. It felt like stroking a cloud, impossibly soft and yielding in a subtle, earthy scent. The very essence of the wild rose to meet him. He began to arrange them, his hands working with a quiet competence honed by years of solitary living. He pulled the heaviest pelts to the center, creating a nest that was both substantial and inviting, and then added a lighter layer of rabbit skins on top, their fur impossibly fine and warm. With the sleeping arrangements made, a final, lingering check of surroundings felt natural. The fire, now reduced to a soft, pulsing hard red, cast a minimal glow, and he moved to the small window, peering out into the inky blackness. The snow, a thick, untroubled blanket, lay silent and deep, muffling any stray sounds from the woods. A few stars, sharp and impossibly bright, pricked through the velvet sky, and for a moment, He felt a quiet kinship with their distant, steady light. The cold outside was a tangible presence, a stark contrast of cocoon of warmth he had created within, and he felt a deep appreciation for the sturdy walls of his cabin, a bulwark against the vastness of the winter. Returning to the center of the room, he gathered the few personal items that accompanied him into the night. His worn leather journal, its pages filled with observations and sketches of the natural world, was carefully placed on a small, low shelf beside his sleeping furs. Next to it, he laid his well-used pipe and a small pouch of dried tobacco, accompanying ritual for future mornings or quiet evenings. These were not possessions of luxury, but tools of his existence, each imbued with the quiet meaning of his life. He ran a callous thumb over the smooth wood of the pipe, remembering the countless hours that had accompanied him, a silent companion in his solitary world. The air in the cabin, still warm from the dying fire, carried a faint, pleasant aroma of wood smoke and dried herbs. He took a deep, slow breath, filling his lungs with this familiar scent, and then exhaled a soft sigh of contentment. The only sound now was a gentle, almost imperceptible creak of the timber as the cabin settled, a subtle language of its own that spoke of stability and permanence. He felt a profound sense of being exactly where he was meant to be, a small, secure point of life in the immense, sleeping wilderness. He shed his outer layers of wool and fur, each garment carefully folded and placed aside, revealing the softer, warmer underclothes that would serve him through the night. The weight of the day's work, the steady rhythm of his tasks, began to recede, replaced by a gentle lassitude that permeated his limbs. He moved to the sleeping furs, the anticipation of rest a sweet and welcome feeling. He sank down into the soft depths, the caribou and rabbit pelts yielding around him, creating an embrace that was both firm and incredibly soft. The warmth of the furs enveloped him, a comforting weight that seemed to press away the lingering chill of the day. He adjusted his position, finding the perfect spot where the softest down cradled his head, and then pulled the heaviest pelts up to his chin. They smelled of the forest of pine needles and damp earth and the clean scent of snow, and this scent, so intrinsically linked to his life, was a lullaby in itself. His body relaxed, the muscles that had been so engaged all day finally surrendering to profound stillness. His eyelids felt heavy, the desire to close them a powerful, undeniable urge. He let them drift shut, the dim glow of the embers now a distant, fading impression. The sounds of the forest, which had been so present earlier, seemed to withdraw even further, becoming a gentle, almost imagined hum. The wind outside was a mere whisper now, a fleeting breath against the sturdy logs of his cabin, and the distant owl had long since fallen silent. The world beyond his warm haven had returned to its deep, profound quiet. His breathing, which had been steady and even throughout the evening, began to slow even further, each inhale and exhale becoming a longer, more languid affair. He felt the rise and fall of his chest, a gentle rhythm that was the only audible reminder of his presence. Thoughts, which had been so easily dismissed earlier, now seemed to dissolve before they could fully form, like mist on a warm morning. There was no need to hold on to them, no desire to analyze or remember. He was simply a body settling into rest, a consciousness merging with the deep peace of the night. The soft pressure of the furs against the skin, the enveloping warmth, the profound silence, these were the only sensations that remained. He felt a sense of deep gratitude, a quiet thankfulness for this simple, profound comfort, for the safety of his cabin and for the quiet rhythm of his days. The worries and demands of the world outside his immediate experience held no sway here. In this sanctuary of slumber, a deep sense of calm washed over him, a wave of pure tranquility that ebbed and flowed with his slowing breaths. He was adrift, not in darkness, but in a soft, warm stillness, a place where the edges of consciousness blurred and faded. The embers in the hearth continued their gentle, silent glow, a tiny, pulsing heart in the vast quiet, and their fading light was a gentle invitation to deeper sleep. He felt himself sinking, not falling, but gently descending into a profound and restorative peace. The last vestiges of awareness drifted away, like leaves carried on a slow, silent stream, and he was no longer thinking, no longer feeling in any conscious way, but simply existing in the quiet, welcoming embrace of the night. The world outside was a vast expanse of snow and silence, and within his cabin, the silence was just as deep, just as complete and utterly peaceful. He was home, and he was safe, and sleep, a gentle ancient force, was now taking him completely into its quiet, restorative care.